The yellow taxi wound through the narrow road lined with birch and maple, their leaves already touched with amber at the edges, and Margaret Holloway watched the landscape shift from asphalt and roadside commerce back into something older and more familiar. She sat upright against the back seat, her hands folded over the small, worn brown leather suitcase that rested on her lap, and she did not move her gaze from the window. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, had stopped asking questions after her single-word answers had made clear she preferred silence. He had asked where she was from, and she had said, Vermont. He had asked if she was visiting family, and she had said no. He had asked if this was her first time in the area, and she had said it was not. After that, he had simply driven. The road curved past the old Miller place where the barn had been painted red once, and now the paint hung in long strips like shed skin. The mailbox read M. Holloway, though her mother had been dead now for 11 months, and beside it stood the gate with its broken latch that Maggie's father had always meant to fix when she was young. She remembered him standing at this gate on autumn mornings, saying that he would repair it this weekend, and then the weekend would come and go, and he would remember it again the following autumn. That was the way of many intentions in her life, she thought. Things meant to be finished, left instead in a state of gentle incompletion. The taxi turned into the drive, and the house rose before them through the tangle of goldenrod and wild clover that had overtaken the front yard. The same house she had left at 22 when she married Thomas Holloway in the white church in town. The same house where she had been born, and where she had lived every autumn and winter and spring and summer, until the day she walked away from it, wearing a white dress and holding roses that her mother had cut from the garden in June. She had thought she would never come back to this house except to visit, and those visits would be formal occasions, marked on the calendar, things she did out of duty and love, but not out of any sense of belonging. But life, it seemed, had other plans for places and for people. The taxi came to a stop on the gravel drive, and Maggie did not move for a moment. She simply sat, looking at the farmhouse. It was a colonial structure, 2 stories with a widow's walk, painted pale yellow with dark green shutters, though the paint had begun to gray, and the shutters hung uneven. The front porch sagged slightly at one corner, the wood swollen and softened by decades of rain and snow. There was a rope swing hanging from the great oak tree, and the rope was frayed, and the plank had warped, the wood weathered to a silvery gray. She had sat in that swing when she was 7 years old, and her mother had pushed her, and she had felt as though she might fly away entirely into the upper branches. She could still feel the pressure of her mother's hands against her back, gentle but firm, launching her into the air. The driver helped her with the suitcase, and she paid him with bills that trembled slightly in her hand, though not from cold. It was a cool day, but not cold, and the trembling came from something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the temperature. The taxi receded down the drive, and Maggie stood alone in the yard with her suitcase and looked at the house. The front door was painted dark green, the same color it had always been. She had the key in her pocket. She had received it in an envelope from the lawyer, along with other documents that she had not fully read. The lawyer's letter had been formal and kind, expressing his condolences for her losses, both her mother's death and her husband Thomas's death, 3 months prior. Margaret had read the letter once and then placed it in a drawer. She did not need the details of probate and executorship explained to her. She knew only that the house was hers now, and she had decided to come here, to return to the place she had left so many years ago before the lawyers could arrange for its disposition. She climbed the porch steps, and they creaked under her brown leather boots, the same kind of sound they had made 40 years ago when she would run down these steps as a girl, late for school, or eager to meet friends in the village. The door opened with a resistance born of dampness and disuse, and she stepped into the front parlor. The air inside was cool and held the particular smell of closed spaces, dust and old wood, and something faintly floral, the ghost of lavender that her mother had stored in the linen closet. It was a smell that seemed to contain her childhood, compressed and preserved like pressed flowers in the pages of a book. The furniture was covered with white sheets, like sleeping forms, arranged in a way that suggested her mother had simply abandoned the rooms and left them in suspension, neither living nor dead, but preserved in a kind of liminal state. There was the sofa where she had lain with measles when she was 9, and her mother had read to her from a book about girls at a school in England. She remembered her mother's voice, steady and clear, reading about dormitories and friendships and the particular sorrows of young girls separated from their families. She had been so ill that the words had seemed to come from very far away, as though her mother were speaking from across a great distance. She remembered thinking that she might die, and she remembered being surprised that her mother did not seem worried about this. Later, when she was older, she understood that her mother had known all along that she would recover, that the measles would pass, and that she would grow up and leave the house and live her own life somewhere else. There was the armchair where her father had sat in the evenings, reading the farm reports and the news from town. He would sit in that chair with a glass of whiskey beside him, the glass sweating in the heat of the lamp, and he would read without speaking for hours. Sometimes Margaret would sit on the carpet near his feet and read her own books, and they would exist together in a companionable silence, their attention on their separate worlds, but their presence registered and acknowledged. She did not pull the sheets away. She moved instead through the rooms as if walking through memory itself, as if the house were not a place made of wood and brick, but rather a layer of her own past, rendered solid and left undisturbed. Each room held something that her mother had carefully put away, had arranged, and then left, as if creating a time capsule for a future that would never arrive. In the dining room, the long table was still there, set with placemats that had faded from their original blue to a pale gray. She remembered holiday dinners at this table, the way her mother would place the turkey before Maggie's father so he could carve it, and how the steam would rise from the platter. There would be candlelight and the best china, and her mother would have worn a dress with long sleeves even in the warmth of the kitchen's work. She had believed that certain occasions demanded a kind of formal grace, an acknowledgment that some moments were set apart from the ordinary texture of life. In the kitchen, the old black stove stood against the wall, its surface already beginning to tarnish, though it had been cleaned and left months ago. It was a heavy cast-iron structure, the kind that required tending and patience, the kind that had been used to heat her entire childhood. There were jars on the shelves, preserves that her mother had made, the labels written in her careful hand. Strawberry June, 1967, and Blueberry August, 1967. The ink had faded slightly, but the letters remained legible, a record of her mother's last full seasons in the kitchen. Maggie did not touch them. She looked at them and thought about her mother standing at the stove, boiling the fruit and the sugar together, the kitchen filling with steam and the smell of summer. Maggie climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, holding the banister, which was smooth beneath her palm from the oil of many hands. The wood was dark and worn, polished by decades of contact. Upstairs there were 4 bedrooms. Her old room was at the end of the hall. The walls were still papered in the pale yellow and white pattern that she had chosen when she was 17, a pattern of small flowers that seemed both sophisticated and innocent to her now. The single bed was still there, with a quilt her grandmother had made, a complex pattern of diamonds in blue and white. There was still a small table beneath the window where she had kept her correspondence, her journals, the small secret architecture of her girl's interior life. She did not open any drawers. She was not ready to see what she had written, what she had thought and felt, when the world was still open before her, and she had believed that her life would be different from her mother's. In her mother's room, the bed was made with precise corners. the kind of hospital corners that Margaret's mother had learned, perhaps, from some domestic manual or from her own mother. There was a hairbrush on the dresser with some long silver hair still caught in the bristles. It was her mother's hair, she knew, her mother's last physical presence in the house. Maggie looked at this brush for a long time, and then turned away. She could not bear to touch it. She spent the night in the downstairs parlor in an armchair, still in her coat, and she did not sleep but rather existed in a state of profound stillness, her eyes open, watching the darkness deepen, and then slowly resolve into gray. Her mind did not rest, but neither did it wander. It seemed to hover in a state of attention, as if she were waiting for something, though she could not say what. When morning came, she heard the sound of a car in the drive. She rose from the chair and went to the window and saw her daughter Vivian stepping out of a blue sedan, holding a leather portfolio under her arm. Margaret had not expected Vivian to arrive so quickly. She had mentioned in her letter that she would be going to the farmhouse, but she had not given a specific date. Yet here was Vivian, already efficient, already armed with plans. Vivian was dressed as she always dressed, in clothes that looked as though they had been ironed that morning, her hair set in waves that had been arranged at a salon, her face already composed into an expression of determined efficiency. She was in her mid-40s, broad-shouldered like her father, with the same dark hair, though she wore hers shorter and set with every blonde highlight that money could procure. She was a beautiful woman in the way that money and attention to detail could make a woman beautiful, though there was something in her face that suggested she had never been entirely convinced of her own beauty, that she was always achieving it through effort rather than possessing it naturally. Margaret went to the door and opened it before Vivian could knock. Vivian embraced her briefly, the kind of embrace one gives to an elderly relative, done correctly but without genuine warmth, and then stepped back and said that she had not slept well on the drive because she had been thinking about the clearing company and how quickly they could have the house emptied. She said that her husband Howard had arranged for them to come the following Wednesday, and that they were the best in the state, very efficient, very professional. There was an expectation in her tone that Margaret would agree, that this was a sensible plan that anyone reasonable would endorse. Maggie did not respond immediately. She looked at her daughter, this woman she had raised and schooled and dressed and loved, and she tried to recognize in her the girl she had been before the world had taught her to want things with such single-minded determination. Vivian as a child had been curious and playful, interested in the why of things. But somewhere along the path between childhood and adulthood, that quality had been replaced by a quality of purpose, a sense that the world was a problem to be solved efficiently and then moved beyond. Vivian moved past her into the house without waiting for an invitation, and she began opening the white sheets from the furniture, letting dust rise in small clouds into the pale morning light. She said that, really, there was nothing here worth keeping, that she and Howard had spoken about what they might want, and there was truly nothing that would fit their house or their style, that it was all old things from an old time, and the best course was to let the professionals handle it. She said this as though it were obvious, as though it were the only rational conclusion. She pulled out papers from her leather portfolio. They were forms related to the clearing and salvage company, she explained, and there was also a document about the sale of the property. She had already been contacted by 3 different developers, she said, who were very interested in farmland in this area. The house would be demolished, of course, the land cleared, and new houses built. It was the way of progress, she said, and she said this as though she were explaining something obvious to a child who did not yet have capacity to understand. Margaret listened to all of this, and then she said quietly that she would like to spend some time in the house before making any decisions. Vivian looked at her as though she had spoken in a language Vivian did not recognize. She said that there was nothing to decide, really, that it was a clear situation, that the sooner everything was handled, the sooner Maggie could go home. Margaret asked where her home was. Vivian did not answer this directly, but instead said that she had already begun looking at senior communities in the Boston area, places with activities and other people Maggie's age. And she was sure Maggie would be much happier there than alone in this old house thinking about the past. This was Vivian's particular cruelty, Margaret thought, though she did not think Vivian intended it as cruelty. Vivian simply could not understand that a house could be a home, that the past was not a burden to be shed, but rather a foundation upon which one stood. Margaret turned away from her daughter and walked to the window and looked out at the yard. She could see the rope swing moving slightly in the morning breeze, swaying without anyone to push it. She said, still looking out the window, that she would like 1 week in the house alone. She said this with a quiet certainty that seemed to give Vivian pause. Vivian said that a week was impractical, that the clearing company was booked, that Howard was very busy, that Maggie could take what she wanted and leave the rest. But there was something in her mother's tone that made Vivian hesitate, some note of absolute finality that could not be argued with. Maggie did not turn around. She said again, and with the same quiet certainty, that she wanted 1 week. Vivian sighed the sigh of someone who has not gotten her way and has decided to tolerate a small delay because the outcome was already certain. She said that 1 week was possible, though it would require moving the clearing company to the following Wednesday, which would cost extra, but she would arrange it. She said that she would leave the papers here, and Maggie could look them over, and they would discuss it again in a week. She was leaving now, she said, because Howard was expecting her for dinner, and she did not like to drive at night. She embraced Maggie again in that same distant way, the kind of embrace that was more a performance of affection than affection itself. And then she was gone, and Margaret heard her daughter's car retreat down the drive with increasing speed, the gravel spraying beneath the tires. That afternoon, after having made herself a light meal from the provisions in the kitchen, Margaret climbed the narrow wooden staircase that led to the attic. She had not been to the attic in decades. The stairs were steeper than she remembered, and the ceiling was lower, so that she had to duck slightly as she made her way up. At the top, the attic opened into a space defined by the slope of the roof, the dormer windows casting pale, slanted light across the floor and onto the accumulated history of decades. There were boxes stacked against the far wall, and trunks of various sizes, and dress forms that stood like headless people in the corners, and rolled rugs that leaned against the eaves like sleeping bodies. There were Christmas decorations still in their boxes, ornaments wrapped in old newspaper, strings of lights coiled loosely and left to tangle. There was the small rocking horse that had belonged to Vivian when she was young, its paint peeling, its mane thin. There was a dress form wearing an old wedding dress, yellowed at the seams, though Margaret did not recognize it, and wondered if it had belonged to her mother or to some other generation of women before her. The entire space was blanketed in dust, and cobwebs hung from the rafters in delicate architectures that spanned from one beam to another. The air was thick and close, carrying the smell of age and abandonment. Yet beneath it, Margaret sensed something unexpected. There was an order here, a deliberateness to the arrangement that suggested her mother had not merely stored things away, but had arranged them with intention, as if creating a landscape of memory that she wanted preserved. It was as if her mother had known that Margaret would come back, had known that someday her daughter would need to find what had been saved, what had been deemed worth keeping, even when the world had changed around it. Margaret walked slowly between the boxes, her footsteps raising small clouds of dust that hung in the amber light from the dormer. In the far corner, beneath a faded canvas drop-cloth, something caught her attention. There was a shape beneath the cloth that was distinctive, unmistakable to anyone who had seen such a thing. The curved top and the particular proportions revealed themselves even through the dust-covered canvas. An old steamer trunk, the kind that people had once used for journeys and for storing precious things. It was exactly the kind of trunk that Margaret's mother would have kept, that people of her generation would have understood the value of, not in monetary terms, but in terms of what it might contain, what it might hold. Margaret moved toward it, and as she did, the afternoon light shifted, and the dust particles around her seemed to hold the quality of something sacred, something from another era, hanging suspended in the present moment. She reached toward the drop cloth and hesitated, and in that hesitation she felt the weight of years, the accumulated silence of 6 decades, the sense that whatever lay beneath that canvas had been waiting, and that in this moment, in this house that had once been her home, and then was not and now was again, something was about to change. The moment stretched between her and the trunk like a held breath, and she could feel in her chest the quickening of something that might have been fear, or might have been hope, or perhaps some combination of the two that had no name. Maggie's eyes had caught on something in the far corner of the attic, half hidden beneath a canvas drop-cloth that had begun to sag under the weight of decades. She moved toward it slowly, her footsteps deliberate on the wooden floorboards, each one creaking beneath her sensible shoes as if the house itself were marking her passage. The autumn light through the dusty window fell at an angle that caught what lay beneath the cloth, and she could see the curve of it now, unmistakable, the rounded lid of a trunk, old and substantial. Her heart had begun to quicken, though she kept her breathing steady, the way she had learned to do in the years when Vivian was small and would wake at night with fevers, when panic served no purpose. She had learned that panic accomplished nothing, that steadiness of purpose was the only useful response to the difficulties life presented. She reached down and began to pull the canvas back, her fingers careful on the rough weave, uncovering inch by inch what lay beneath. The cloth was heavy with accumulated dust, and she coughed as she worked, not wanting to breathe in the particles of her mother's past, of time itself made tangible. The cloth came away eventually, settling into a heap of gray dust beside her feet, and there it was, a trunk. Not a discarded piece of refuse or a forgotten storage box, but a trunk of the kind her mother had spoken of in those final years when she was lucid, in those lucid moments when her mind traveled backward to her own youth, when her father was still alive and the farmhouse was full of voices and purpose. The steamer trunk was beautiful in a way that spoke of another era entirely, its curved lid painted with faded floral panels that had once been vibrant. She could see traces of rose and violet and gold leaf in the crevices where the paint had not peeled away. The paint was the kind that had been applied by hand, deliberately, with intention. The brass fittings that framed the lid and ran along its sides had darkened with age, their luster dulled, but they held a weight that suggested quality, craftsmanship, the kind of care that went into objects meant to endure. Leather straps, worn soft with use, bound the trunk at intervals, and the leather itself had faded to a color like old tobacco, cracked here and there but still supple when she touched it. The straps showed the indentations of travel, of being handled, of journeys taken. Maggie knelt beside it, her knees protesting only slightly, and ran her hand along the painted panels. The brushwork was careful, deliberate, the work of someone who understood the importance of beauty in everyday objects. Someone had painted this with love, or at least with the intention that it be beautiful to look upon, that whoever owned it might find pleasure in it beyond its mere utility. She traced the outline of a rose, her finger following the curve of a petal that had faded to almost nothing, barely visible now beneath the protective glass she could sense had been applied long ago. The touch of her finger stirred something in her, something she could not name, a feeling that was part sadness and part recognition. She felt suddenly that she was touching her mother's hands across the space of many years, that the care her mother had taken in preserving beautiful things was itself a kind of message, a kind of love. The trunk was locked. A brass plate surrounded a small keyhole below the curved front edge of the lid, and the key was missing. She sat back on her heels, considering this. Her mother would have kept the key somewhere safe, though safe was a relative term, in a house that had been closed since her mother's death 2 years ago, in a bedroom that no one had disturbed, in drawers and boxes whose contents had been deemed not worth the sorting by people who had no time for sentimentality, no patience for the past. She would search for it, she decided. There was time enough. There was, in fact, nothing but time, stretching out before her until the end of the month when Vivian's deadline loomed, when the house would be signed away to whatever buyer Howard Holloway Pierce had found, to whatever purpose it would serve in a future that did not include Maggie's family. Eleanor Briggs arrived that afternoon with a basket of apples from her own trees, their skin dull red in the autumn light, flecked with small imperfections that spoke of honest cultivation rather than commercial polish. She came into the kitchen without knocking, the way she always did, her shoes tapping lightly on the linoleum, and set the basket on the worn table with the care of someone placing something precious. The table itself was scarred with the marks of decades, with the small indentations and stains that spoke of real living, of meals prepared and eaten, of the accumulated minor accidents of daily life. Eleanor was older than Maggie by at least a decade, her hair completely white and set in small, tight waves, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes sharp and clear, missing nothing. She had known Maggie's mother since they were girls together, a friendship that had survived marriages and children and the slow passage of time that wore most friendships away to nothing. There was a quality of permanence to Eleanor's presence in the house, as if she belonged there almost as much as Maggie did. After Maggie had given her tea, strong and hot the way Eleanor preferred it, and they had settled in the parlor with the autumn chill beginning to creep in through the windows, the air carrying the scent of the apples Eleanor had brought, Eleanor asked her about the house, about whether Vivian had set a deadline, about whether Maggie was going to sell. The questions were kind, not intrusive, the way Eleanor's questions had always been. She was not a woman to pry, but she was deeply interested in the inner lives of the people she cared for, and she cared for Maggie the way one cares for family, with a deep and steadfast affection. After Maggie had answered, yes, Vivian wanted it done by the end of the month, there was always some pressure or other that was simply Vivian's way. Eleanor had fallen silent, and her eyes had taken on that faraway look that came when memory was being retrieved from a great distance, from the depths of a life lived long. She was looking past Maggie, past the parlor, past the present moment entirely. She had known Maggie's mother before she was Maggie's mother, when she was still Eleanor's friend, still a girl with dreams like any other girl, with a future that seemed to stretch out endlessly before her. "Your mother," Eleanor had said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood the weight that words could carry, was particular about certain things. She kept her own counsel about most matters, you know the way she was. But there was one thing she spoke of often when we were young, before she married your father, before all the years and all the responsibilities began to accumulate. She always said her wedding trunk was the most precious thing she ever owned. Not the pearls that your father gave her, not the ring itself, not the house itself with all its land and its history, but that trunk. She said she had packed it with her own hands, every item chosen with care, and that every item in it meant something. Eleanor had paused to take a sip of her tea, which had grown lukewarm in the telling, and she had looked directly at Maggie then, her eyes filled with a kind of knowing that suggested she understood more than she was saying. Maggie felt something shift in her understanding of the past, some small door opening that she had not known was there. The trunk upstairs, the one she had not yet opened, took on a different weight in her mind, a different significance entirely. It was not merely an old piece of furniture or a storage container. It was a kind of message from her mother, a kind of testimony to the things that had mattered most in her life. That evening, after Eleanor had left, and the house had begun to settle into the particular silence of autumn dusk, the kind that came only in the early fall when the summer sounds had not yet been replaced by the winter winds, Maggie had returned to the attic. She brought an oil lamp, not entirely trusting the electrical light that hung from the ceiling in a fixture that had been installed sometime in the 1920s and had never been fully reliable, and its glow seemed to soften everything it touched, to render the room less like a place of storage and abandonment and more like a place of rest. The trunk waited where she had left it, patient and mysterious, the painted roses faintly visible in the warm light, as if waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly this person to come and discover them. The October dusk was deepening beyond the window, the light turning blue and cold. On her mother's bureau downstairs, in the room that still held the faint scent of lavender and mothballs, the scents that had defined her mother's life as much as any narrative or achievement, Maggie had found a small jewelry box covered in worn velvet the color of faded plums. Inside, amid a tangle of old costume jewelry and a tarnished locket whose image no one could quite make out anymore, had been a key. It was small and brass, with an ornamental bow at the top shaped like a small rose, exactly the size to fit the lock on the trunk upstairs. She held it now in her palm, feeling its weight, which was negligible and yet seemed somehow significant, heavy with purpose. The Holloway farmhouse had been full of small, significant things, details that added up to the texture of her mother's life, to the choices she had made and the values she had held. Every object told a story if one was quiet enough to listen. That night she had not opened the trunk. There was something in her that wanted to wait, to sit with the knowledge of it, to approach it with the kind of reverence that such an object seemed to deserve. She had placed the key on the small table beside the trunk and had gone downstairs to her narrow bed in the guest room, a room that had been hers before she married, before her own life had unfolded in another part of the state, in another house, before Vivian was born, and childhood became something that belonged to other people. She had lain listening to the wind pick up outside, the old house shifting and settling around her, groaning slightly as the temperature dropped, the wood contracting, the familiar sounds of a house that had been home for so many years before she left it. The phone had rung the next morning, early, while Maggie was still in the kitchen with a cup of cooling coffee, the kitchen that smelled of oatmeal and the remembered breakfasts of her childhood. She had been at the table reading a section of yesterday's newspaper, not focusing on the words but allowing her mind to settle into the familiar rhythms of the morning, when the phone's insistent bell had cut through the quiet. It was Vivian. Her voice had that particular quality it took on when she was managing something, when she had decided that her will was the only reasonable one, and was now merely going through the motions of informing everyone else of this fact, going through a ritual that she believed was consultation, but which was really just announcement. "Howard has found someone interested in the property," Vivian had said, without preamble, without any greeting or inquiry as to how her mother was, what she had found, how she was managing in the old house. "They're prepared to make an offer by this Friday. You need to sign the papers by then. I don't know what you're doing up there, Mother, but it needs to be done. The school year is starting, and I can't have this hanging over my head." The implication was clear, as it always was with Vivian. Maggie's needs, Maggie's discoveries, Maggie's time meant less than Vivian's convenience. Maggie had said very little in response. She had learned long ago, through decades of motherhood and then widowhood, that argument with Vivian was futile, that her daughter had made up her mind before she called, and that no amount of explanation or persuasion or simple maternal authority would change that. Vivian was not a woman to be reasoned with. She was a woman to be endured. But after she had hung up the phone, after she had set it carefully back in its cradle, with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial, she had felt a kind of determination settle over her, quiet and unmovable as the mountains that surrounded the farmhouse. She would not be rushed. There was something in the trunk upstairs that belonged to her, that her mother had chosen to preserve for her, and she would not let it be erased by Vivian's timeline, by Howard Holloway Pierce's buyer, by anyone else's sense of what was urgent and what was not. Wesley had arrived mid-morning with his truck, a young man from the village whose father had done odd jobs for Maggie's mother for 40 years, who had grown up knowing the farmhouse as a kind of second home. He was strong and careful with old things, respectful of them in a way that suggested good upbringing, the kind of upbringing that had become less common as the years accumulated. When Maggie asked him to help her carry something down from the attic, he had asked no questions, only nodded and followed her up the narrow stairs, his footsteps careful and measured. The trunk was heavy, heavier than it appeared, but together they managed it, Wesley taking most of the weight with his youth and his strength, Maggie steadying it from below with her knowledge of how delicate old things could be. It emerged from the attic like something being born, coming backward down the stairs, Wesley guiding it with patience, and then it was down the stairs and into the parlor, where Maggie had arranged it on a low table in front of the windows, a place where the light could reach it. Wesley had left quietly after that, understanding without being told that what would come next was private, that some discoveries were meant to be made alone. Maggie was alone with the trunk. She had drawn the curtains against the afternoon light, wanting to see it in the soft illumination from the floor lamp, the kind of lamp that her father had brought home from the city in 1946, an object that had outlasted him by more than 20 years. She had sat down in her mother's old chair, the upholstered wingback that held the shape of her mother's body even now, years after her mother's death, and she had looked at the trunk for a long time before she did anything else. The trunk seemed to glow under the lamplight, the painted panels catching the warmth, the brass fittings gleaming softly. She held the small brass key in her hand, turning it over and over, allowing herself the moment before the opening, the moment of anticipation before the thing she might discover became real and irreversible, before words and images and feelings would spill out into the world and could not be contained again. Then, deliberately, she stood, and she crossed to the trunk, and she fitted the key into the lock. It turned with surprising smoothness, the mechanism inside releasing with a soft click, the sound of machinery that had waited patiently for the right moment to spring open. The lid creaked as she lifted it, the sound of old leather straps and old hinges, a sound like something waking after a long sleep, like an animal stirring after hibernation. The trunk opened fully, and Maggie leaned back to see what lay inside. Tissue paper, layers of it, yellowed with age but still intact, still folded with deliberate care, the kind of care that only came from intention. She could smell it faintly, a scent that was not quite lavender and not quite rose, something her mother must have chosen decades ago to preserve whatever lay beneath, to protect it from the decay that time brought to everything. The scent brought back memories of her mother's closet, of childhood visits where she had stood on tiptoe to peer at the hung dresses and the folded linens. Her hands moved without her quite commanding them to move, and she began to unfold the tissue paper, each layer revealing more beneath, each fold a kind of barrier between past and present. And then there was cloth, white cloth, linen so fine it was almost translucent, so delicate that it seemed impossible it could have survived so long. She lifted it carefully, understanding even before she saw it fully that this was her mother's wedding gown, and the weight of it in her hands was the weight of preserved time, of a day that had been so important it had been folded away and kept safe, kept like a prayer, kept in the heart of a believer. The gown was exquisite in a way that stole her breath slightly. Hand-stitched, she could see that immediately, the seams so fine they were almost invisible, the work of someone with infinitely patient hands. The lace panels that formed the sleeves and the neckline were delicate as spider silk, fine enough to see through, the kind of lace that would have taken weeks to acquire or to make. The fabric itself had not yellowed despite its years enclosed in the darkness of the trunk, the careful preservation having done its work perfectly. There was lace underneath the gown, delicate gloves of a style she recognized from old photographs, the kind of glove that women no longer wore, and pressed among the folds of cloth was a bouquet, long since dried, its flowers still holding the shape of their original arrangement, still recognizable as the arrangement they had once been. White violets, she thought, though she could not be entirely certain. The color faded to nearly nothing, the petals papery and fragile. But she remembered her mother mentioning white violets once, saying they had been her favorite, that they smelled of spring even in autumn, that they had been the one thing she had insisted on for her wedding day. Beneath the gown there was more. A stack of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been blue and had faded to a color like smoke, like watercolor in rain. An envelope, sealed and addressed in her mother's careful script, and a small case of dark velvet, the kind that had once held jewelry, the kind of case that contained precious things. Maggie removed each item carefully, placing them on the table beside the trunk, building an arrangement of these fragments of her mother's inner life, these pieces of what she had chosen to preserve, what she had deemed worthy of safekeeping. It was only when she lifted the wedding gown away entirely, supporting its weight in both hands, that she found the last item. An envelope, sealed with wax that had turned brittle with age, lay at the very bottom of the trunk, nestled in the final layer of tissue paper. The paper was cream-colored and expensive-looking, the kind of paper that had been chosen for its quality, for its ability to convey importance. The address was written in her mother's hand, precise and steady, the script that came from Catholic school penmanship, from a time when such things mattered. It was addressed to Margaret, her full name, the name she had been christened with before Vivian had nicknamed her Maggie, and the name had somehow stuck, becoming her true name in the way that childhood names do. Maggie set down the wedding gown and picked up the envelope. Her hands were shaking slightly now, though she was not certain why, though she suspected it was because she understood, somewhere in the depths of what she knew, that what lay inside this envelope would change something, would illuminate something, would answer questions she had not known to ask. The envelope was warm from her hands, and it seemed almost fragile, as if the paper might give way if she handled it too roughly, as if it might tear and spill its contents onto the floor. She sat back down in her mother's chair, and she held the envelope in her lap, not opening it yet, merely holding it, understanding that the moment before opening was a moment that would not come again, that once she read what her mother had written, once she knew what her mother had chosen to tell her, everything would be different. Eleanor Briggs had said that her mother had packed the trunk with her own hands, that every item meant something. Maggie held the envelope and waited, understanding that there were some moments in a life that could not be rushed. The envelope was thin, cream-colored, sealed with a wafer of wax that had long since become brittle. Margaret's fingers trembled as she lifted it from beneath the folds of the wedding gown, and she could see, in faded pencil script across the front, her own name written in handwriting she recognized with an ache in her chest, her mother's careful penmanship. Dated March 1959, just weeks before Dorothy Mercer had slipped away from pneumonia, a quiet illness that had seemed to come upon her all at once, stealing her breath and her time before anyone could truly say goodbye. Margaret sat on the edge of the trunk, the envelope resting in her palm, and she did not open it immediately. Instead, she sat with it the way one might sit with a living thing, gathering the courage to listen to what it contained. The afternoon light had shifted by the time she broke the seal, sliding her finger beneath the flap with the care of someone handling something sacred. Inside was a single page, folded twice, the writing dense and deliberate, and as Margaret unfolded it, her mother's voice seemed to emerge from the ink itself, speaking across 9 years as though Dorothy Mercer stood beside her in that dusty room, present and immediate. The letter began simply, "My dearest Margaret," and proceeded to explain, in the methodical way her mother had always possessed, exactly what lay in the trunk and why. It was not waste. It was not sentiment alone, though sentiment had always been woven through it. The wedding gown, her mother wrote, had been stitched by Margaret's grandmother, Catherine Mercer, and Catherine's mother, Elizabeth, together over the winter of 1908, each stitch placed by hand, each seam a small prayer and promise. The lace itself had been imported from Belgium, ordered at considerable expense, and with no small amount of hope, because Catherine had believed her only daughter deserved beauty that transcended the ordinary. A seamstress in the village had been consulted, and the family pattern had been drawn, but the actual construction had fallen to the two women who understood better than anyone what it meant to build something that might outlast them. The gown was museum quality, her mother had written, and had been appraised in 1938 at a sum Margaret's eyes widened to see written plainly. She read the numbers twice to make certain she understood them correctly. $3,500. A fortune in any era, and in 1938 enough to have changed everything. The small velvet jewelry case contained her grandmother's pearl and diamond brooch, the one Margaret had seen only once as a child, a brief moment when her grandmother had lifted it from its hiding place and allowed Margaret to touch the cool pearls with one small finger. That brooch had been kept through the Depression, her mother wrote, when every piece of value in the house had been scrutinized and weighed against hunger and bills and the constant grinding uncertainty of survival. Catherine Mercer had refused to sell it, though she could have, though doing so would have eased 1,000 small hardships. Instead, she had hidden it away in this trunk, and when an appraiser came to the house in the late 1930s, before his expertise faded into old age and memory, he had valued it at a substantial sum. $4,000, the letter said. Margaret's mother wrote that she was leaving everything in the trunk to her only daughter, not through the formality of a lawyer's document, though she had one, carefully filed with the papers in her secretary downstairs, but with this letter as her witness and testament, the dress, the brooch, all that would be found within. It was meant for Margaret alone, not to be sold or divided, but to be preserved as a bridge between the women who came before and whatever future Margaret herself might build. Below the letter, secured with faded blue ribbon, were dozens of smaller envelopes, tied in a bundle that Margaret now held with reverent care. These were letters, her mother explained, written between Margaret's grandparents during the First World War, when Grandfather James Mercer had been stationed overseas, and Grandmother Catherine had remained at home with a young daughter, writing every single day without fail. They were private correspondence, intimate and deeply personal, filled with details of daily life and longings that had never been meant for anyone's eyes but the recipient's. Yet her mother believed they deserved to be preserved, perhaps even given to an archive or historical society where others might learn the daily truth of how families endured separation and maintained love across distance and uncertainty, and the terrible waiting that war imposed upon ordinary people. Margaret read her mother's letter 3 times, and by the third reading, tears had begun to fall upon the paper, small circles of salt water that she was careful not to let pool or run. She folded the letter with reverent precision and set it gently on the windowsill, positioning it so the fading light fell across the words her mother had written with such care. Then she turned to the bundle of letters tied in blue ribbon. Her hands were steadier now, though her heart moved slowly in her chest. She untied the ribbon carefully, preserving it, and withdrew one of the smaller envelopes at random. The postmark was June 1917, and the envelope was addressed in her grandfather's careful script to Mrs. Catherine Mercer, Riverside Road, Guilford, Vermont. Inside was a single page, 2 sides written in a fountain pen in the distinctive hand Margaret remembered from documents she had seen only rarely, and it began, "My dearest wife." Margaret read of war and weather, of men he had met and work he had done in the muddy camps of France. But more than that, she read of longing. She read of how he thought of her face when he woke in the pale gray light of dawn, and how the thought of her letters, arriving in batches because mail was slow and unpredictable and sometimes lost entirely, was the thing that kept him upright on the most difficult days. She read of how he loved her, plainly and repeatedly, as though love itself was a fact he needed to state daily to keep it real and alive across the vast distance. She read of how he dreamed of ordinary things, of her garden and her voice, and the particular way she arranged flowers in the blue vase that had belonged to her mother. Margaret replaced the letter in its envelope, her own breathing shallow, and held the bundle for a long moment. The blue ribbon felt fragile, as though it might give way if she held it too tightly. Then she turned her attention to the brooch. She found the velvet case tucked beneath the wedding gown's hem, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled softly as she unfolded it with infinite care. The brooch was smaller than she remembered from that one childhood moment, but no less luminous. The pearls were warm to the touch, softer somehow than she had imagined pearls could be, and the diamonds caught the late afternoon light, throwing small rainbows across her fingers and painting the white walls of the attic with fragments of color. She held it up to the window and watched the light refract through the stone, and she understood in that moment why her grandmother had not sold it, why it had been worth the risk of keeping it even when keeping meant doing without other things, going without new dresses, fixing old shoes when new ones would have been easier. It was beautiful in a way that transcended its monetary value, though the monetary value was itself extraordinary. It was witness. It was proof that beauty could endure. It was a statement made in pearls and diamond about the kind of woman Catherine Mercer had been and the kind of legacy she had chosen to leave. She placed the brooch gently back into its case and set it on the windowsill beside her mother's letter, where the light could continue to catch it. The next morning, Eleanor Briggs appeared at the door with a warm loaf of bread, still steaming slightly in the late autumn air, and honest curiosity about what had been discovered in the dusty reaches above the house. Eleanor was a woman who understood the language of old houses and old things, who could read a room and understand what it meant, and she had not lived 78 years in a small village without developing an eye for value, both monetary and emotional. Margaret showed her the trunk, led her up the narrow attic stairs, and Eleanor moved slowly through the space, taking in the particulars of it. When Margaret lifted the wedding gown and carefully displayed it, Eleanor ran her fingers along the lace with the reverence of someone who understood what hand-stitching meant, how many hours of labor lived in each seam. Then Margaret showed her the brooch. When Eleanor saw it, her eyes filled with tears immediately, and she sat down slowly on the edge of the trunk, as though her legs could no longer support her weight. She asked if she could hold it, and Margaret placed it in her weathered palm. Eleanor held it as though it were a living thing, as though it might speak to her if she listened carefully enough. She closed her eyes for a moment. "My grandmother showed this to me once," Eleanor said quietly, her voice thick with memory. "I was maybe 7 or 8, visiting your grandmother on an afternoon in summer, and she brought me into her room and opened her jewelry box and let me see it. She said it was the most valuable thing she owned, and not for money, though she said money was part of it. She said it was proof that a woman could preserve something beautiful even when the world was trying to take everything. She said that was a kind of power that didn't show up on anyone's ledger, but mattered more than any amount in a bank account." Eleanor closed her hand around the brooch and sat in silence for a long moment before handing it back to Margaret with shaking fingers. "I've never forgotten it," she said. "I never understood why she told me that, a child. But I understand now. I understand that she was telling me something about survival that they don't teach in schools." Wesley arrived midway through the morning, bringing with him a thermos of coffee and the same quiet competence he brought to every task. When Margaret mentioned casually that there were things in the trunk that might require expert attention, things that seemed to be of considerable value, he had nodded with the certainty of a man who understood that some matters required knowledge beyond one's own, and he had suggested someone in Brattleboro, a man named Harlan Whitfield, who had spent 40 years dealing in antiques and rare items, and had the kind of knowledge that transcended mere pricing. Harlan Whitfield arrived 2 hours later in a sensible sedan, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to see value that others had overlooked. Wesley showed him into the attic, and Margaret watched as Harlan approached the wedding gown first, his movements careful and deliberate, the movements of a man whose livelihood had taught him to understand the fragility of beautiful things. He did not touch it immediately, but only looked, his eyes traveling over the seams, the lace, the construction of the bodice, the particular fall of the skirt, the tiny handmade details that separated true craftsmanship from merely competent work. When he finally placed a single finger against one seam, touching the thread that had been laid down by Elizabeth and Catherine Mercer more than 50 years earlier, he closed his eyes as though he were listening to something only he could hear, a voice that traveled through the decades via the medium of thread and intention. "This is museum-quality work," he said without turning around, his voice steady and certain. "Belgian lace, hand-finished throughout, every seam constructed with a precision that speaks to someone who understood their craft intimately. The construction itself belongs in a textile conservation course. This dress is not a wedding gown, strictly speaking. This is a work of art, a garment that will only become more valuable with time." He turned then and looked at Margaret with an expression of genuine respect. "Do you have any documentation for the makers?" Margaret showed him the letter from her mother, and Harlan read it slowly, nodding to himself, making small sounds of acknowledgement, understanding now that he stood in the presence of something that went beyond value, that spoke to inheritance and intention, and the choices women had made about beauty and legacy. He examined the brooch next, using a loupe he produced from his jacket pocket, and he spent nearly 15 minutes studying the pearls and the diamond setting, adjusting his loupe, leaning in and back to catch different angles of light. He made small sounds, hums of recognition, as though he were having a conversation with the object. Finally, he removed the loupe and looked at Margaret directly. "Your grandmother had excellent taste and considerable access to quality materials," he said. "This brooch is worth somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 at current market value, possibly more to a serious private collector who specializes in turn-of-the-century jewelry. The pearls alone are notable, lustrous, and well-preserved, but the diamond is what makes it extraordinary. It's a quality stone. A collector would pay very well indeed for a piece like this." He turned to the bundle of letters, and here his manner became almost reverential, the manner of a man confronting something rarer than any object of precious metal or stone. "May I?" Margaret nodded, and Harlan carefully unfolded one of the older letters, reading the opening lines silently. He closed it gently and held the bundle in both hands as though it might dissolve if he held it too tightly. "These belong in an archive," he said quietly. "A university or a historical society dedicated to the First World War era, or perhaps even a major library. The intimate record of how families sustained themselves during wartime, the daily texture of separation and longing, the voice of an ordinary man writing to his wife during extraordinary circumstances. This is primary source material of real significance. Historians would treasure this collection. You could donate them or sell them, but their greatest value is in their preservation and accessibility for scholarly research." It was past midday when Vivian Holloway Pierce arrived at the house, her husband Howard following in a separate automobile, a large sedan that spoke of professional success and a comfortable life conducted at a considerable distance from the concerns of elderly widows and attic trunks. Behind them came the truck from the estate clearing company, a vehicle marked with the company's name in bold letters, a vehicle that spoke of purpose and swift action, of surfaces to be cleared and unwanted things to be disposed of. Vivian descended from her car with the bearing of a woman who had come to settle a matter, to impose order on disorder, to accomplish what she had set out to accomplish. But she had not expected to find guests waiting at the house. She had not expected to find Harlan Whitfield standing at the foot of an attic staircase with a wedding gown draped carefully across his forearms, or Wesley standing nearby with the air of a man who had made certain that an expert opinion was obtained before anything irreplaceable was allowed to leave the premises. For a moment, Vivian's mouth opened and closed without words emerging, and Margaret could see the sequence of realizations moving across her daughter's face like clouds crossing an open sky. Harlan Whitfield introduced himself with quiet professionalism and proceeded to explain, in clear and measured terms, exactly what the trunk contained and what that content represented in terms of cultural and monetary value. The wedding gown alone, he explained, would command significant money at auction or in private sale to a serious collector of historical textiles. Somewhere in the region of $4,000 to $5,000, possibly more depending on provenance documentation and the reputation of the seamstresses. The brooch was worth thousands, 3 to 4 at minimum, possibly more with the right buyer. The letters, while not for sale, represented a historical collection of considerable scholarly importance that would be invaluable to researchers and archivists interested in the era of the First World War and the domestic experience of wartime separation. Vivian stood motionless as Harlan spoke, and Margaret could see the slow transformation of her daughter's expression, the moment-by-moment realization of what had nearly been discarded, what had nearly been sold by the pound to a company that would have assessed value by weight and bulk alone, that would have separated the objects into piles marked valuable and worthless, and sent the worthless piles to a landfill or incinerator. When Harlan finished speaking, Vivian looked at Margaret, and for the first time in years, Margaret saw something like genuine shame in her daughter's face. It was shame without disguise or pretense, shame that had no armor of explanation or justification. "I thought it was all just," Vivian began, then stopped, her voice very quiet. "I didn't know. I should have asked. I should have looked more carefully. Margaret, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I dismissed it all without even looking, without understanding what it was. I nearly sold it all for so little." Margaret nodded slowly. She did not deny that forgiveness would have been more quickly offered if her daughter had treated her own mother's possessions or her own mother's judgment with more respect. But she offered it anyway, because Vivian was her daughter and because the finding of the trunk had nothing to do with Vivian and everything to do with what had been preserved across decades, what had endured, what mattered, when time had the mercy to return it to those who would understand its significance. Vivian began to explain that of course Margaret should keep the trunk and everything in it, that she had only been trying to help, that she had thought it was all worthless, that she had wanted to ease the burden of managing a large house alone. But Margaret raised a hand gently, and Vivian fell silent. "It's all right," Margaret said simply. "It's done now." That evening Margaret was alone in the parlor, and the light had grown soft and golden with the approach of dusk, that particular quality of autumn light that made everything it touched seem briefly illuminated from within. The wedding gown had been carefully laid across the back of the chair near the window, and the lamplight caught the lace in such a way that it seemed almost to glow from within, as though the fabric itself had absorbed light and was now releasing it slowly. Her mother's letter lay in her lap, folded carefully, and beside her on the side table the brooch rested on its blue velvet case, the pearls and diamonds glinting softly in the warm lamplight, casting small sparkles across the surface of the dark wood. Margaret looked at each of these things in turn, understanding that something more than a trunk had been found in the attic. What had been recovered was not merely objects, but connection, continuity, proof that the women who had come before her, her grandmother Catherine, her great-grandmother Elizabeth, her mother Dorothy, had understood something about beauty and endurance that had nothing to do with the convenience of the present moment and everything to do with faith that someone in the future would be wise enough to preserve it, to choose preservation over ease, inheritance over disposal. Outside, the Vermont autumn was turning the trees 100 shades of gold and red and burnt orange, and the wind carried with it the scent of change and the memory of countless seasons that had passed before and would pass again. Margaret sat with the letter and the gown and the brooch, and she felt in the gathering darkness that her mother's voice was close by, not in the way of ghosts or fancies, but in the way of all things that remain alive in the heart of those who loved them, present through memory and intention and the ordinary artifacts of a life lived with care. She thought of Eleanor's tears at the sight of the brooch and the story Eleanor had carried for 70 years about a grandmother's quiet demonstration of defiance, of choosing beauty even in the face of deprivation. She thought of Wesley's quiet loyalty and his understanding that some things could not be carelessly handled. She thought of even Vivian's shame-faced realization and the way that shame, though unwelcome, might teach something about the consequences of dismissal and the value of pause. She thought of her grandparents writing to each other across an ocean of distance and fear and terrible uncertainty, choosing to preserve their love in ink because they believed that love was worth preserving, that the testimony of intimacy mattered, that future generations might someday need to know that ordinary people had loved one another with the kind of constancy that could not be broken even by war. She thought of her great-grandmother and her grandmother bending over lace and cloth in the winter of 1908, stitching beauty into being with their own hands, because they understood something fundamental about what mattered, about what would outlast them, about the kind of testament they wanted their handiwork to carry. The lamp burned warm on the side table, and Margaret folded her mother's letter carefully and held it against her chest, feeling its thinness, its fragility, its power. And in that moment of quiet vindication and peace, watching the last light fade from the windows and the wedding gown grow luminous in the darkness, she understood that she was the keeper now of all that had been preserved, the inheritor of the choices her mothers had made about beauty and defiance and the future, and that this quiet inheritance was itself a form of vindication, the slow blooming that comes not from triumph, but from the faithful return of what was nearly lost. For some flowers only bloom after the storm.